Thank you for joining us today. I'm glad you're taking time out of your schedule to listen to this period of Bible study. There are many heroes of faith. Sometimes the heroes are not who we think they might be. Sometimes the heroes might have names that we do not even know. But they're heroes because they make an immeasurable contribution to the works of God. One of these heroes of the faith, which we little know about, is Epaphroditus. Indeed, the average person would really have no idea of who he was. His name is only mentioned twice in the New Testament, Philippians chapter 2 and verse 25, and then again in chapter 4 and verse 18. As far as we know, he preached no sermons, did no missionary work as we think about it. He converted no one or established no churches. So as some people might think, well, he wasn't a very good Christian, was he? But yet Paul said he was. I think we need to look at Epaphroditus. Look at what Paul says about him. Maybe some of us may pattern our life after him, and some of you may be heroes, just like Epaphroditus was a hero. The background, of course, is while Paul was in prison in Rome. The church at Philippi sent a gift to assist him in his trouble. And the church sent their gift by their own personal missionary, which was Epaphroditus. But Epaphroditus, when he got there, he stayed in order to assist Paul with his work. But yet somehow, while he was in Rome, he had gotten sick and had almost died. And now Paul was sending him back to Philippi because naturally the people in the Philippi were very concerned about him. And Paul wanted to relieve their anxiety, so he very unselfishly gave up his noble helper and sends the Philippians letter by Epaphroditus back to the church in Philippi. And now let's look at what Paul says concerning Epaphroditus. In chapter 2 and verse 25, he says, "Yet I considered it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother, fellow worker and fellow soldier, but your messenger and the one who ministered to my need." Notice how Paul describes this Christian. He first describes him as a brother. This means, of course, he was in the family of God. Indeed, we as children of God are all brothers. 1 John 3 and verse 1, John said, "Behold, what manner of love the Father has bestowed upon us, that we should be called children of God." We as Christians are all children of God. Therefore, we are all brothers. None is any more important than anyone else. We're all just simply brothers in Christ. And here Paul called Epaphroditus a brother. He also called him, though, his fellow worker. Work is essential to salvation. Some people get the idea today that we as Christians do not really have to do anything and still be saved, but yet we should, because Paul said Epaphroditus was his fellow worker. We find in 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 9, when Paul was talking to the church in Corinth, he said, "For we are God's fellow workers. You're God's field, you are God's building." Notice he said Corinth, the church at Corinth, was his fellow workers. In 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 58, Paul said, "Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. For you know your labor is not in vain with the Lord." Notice Paul said we need to be abounding in the work of God. Yes, we should be workers for God. Epaphroditus was serving Paul, though. But when we serve others, we also serve Christ. Paul said that he ministered to Paul's needs. Indeed, there are many people today like Epaphroditus. They may have never preached a sermon. They may never have led a song, but they strengthen and encourage those who do. They are very supportive, and they can be relied upon to do whatever needs to be done. It's been said behind every man or every good man is a good woman. Well, it could also be very well said, behind every successful preacher there is a good group of Christians. In other words, everyone who very publicly does a good job for God must be supported by several people behind him. He cannot do it all by himself. Well, Epaphroditus was part of that group that supported Paul in whatever situation he might be in. He was a great fellow worker for Paul. He was his servant. But then Paul also called him his fellow soldier. The Christian life is a warfare. Paul told Timothy in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 3, "You therefore must endure hardship as a good soldier of Jesus Christ." Indeed, we are all soldiers. We're in God's army, so to speak. But then also Paul called Epaphroditus their messenger. The word for messenger here is the Greek word apostolos, which sometimes it could be used in reference to the 12 apostles. The word simply means one sent out on a special mission. And so Epaphroditus was sent out by the church, and so therefore he was an apostle. He was a messenger from the church. He was sent to Rome. Now this was a long way. Rome was about 950 kilometers from Philippi. And that was a hard travel. It'd be a hard travel even today to travel that far. But of course there was no airplanes back then. You most often traveled that far by boat. But sea travel was often hard itself. There were no passengers vessels like we do to have today. The sea travel was most often on cargo vessels with few cabin accommodations and meals and no real luxuries at all. But Epaphroditus made this journey to serve Paul. He did not make this journey to serve himself or to be some great missionary or to get a lot of praise and honor. He made this journey to help the church in Philippi and to serve Paul. Also in chapter 2 in verse 25, Paul said that he was the one who ministered to his need. He was a minister or a servant, and he volunteered to make this dangerous journey. Sea travel back in those days, of course, was very dangerous, much more dangerous than what it is today. You remember Paul at one time was shipwrecked and was almost lost his life. So sea travel could be very dangerous back in those days, but Epaphroditus readily volunteered to make that dangerous journey, that long journey to Rome. You know, we need to have the same spirit of sacrificial service that Epaphroditus did. We need to be willing just to serve. Jesus said in Matthew 20 and verse 28, "Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." Jesus came to serve others. If we're going to be followers of Christ, we need to be willing to serve others too. And Epaphroditus was very unselfish in his concern for Paul and his concern for the Philippian church. He was willing to serve Paul and said not for personal honor and glory, but simply to help the Apostle Paul. And then in verse 26, we find what Paul says concerning Epaphroditus. He says, "Since he was longing for you all and was distressed because you had heard that he was sick." Paul was now sending him back to Philippi. And the reason was because the Philippians had heard that he had been sick, and therefore they were very concerned about him. He was distressed. Paul said he was very distressed. The word for distressed could be translated full of heaviness, as it did in the King James. The only other time this word is used in the New Testament is to describe Jesus' mental state in the Garden of Gethsemane. Indeed, he was full of distress for what the Philippian church thought about him. You see, his concern was not for himself, but he did not want to be a burden on those that loved him and those that he loved. We see that same love in physical families oftentimes in this world. When someone gets older, they sometimes are not in very good health, and they have to rely on their family members to help take care of them. And for many, that's a very difficult time because they don't want to be a burden on everyone else. But they have to. There's no way to keep from it. But you see that burden in their hearts, that they are a burden on everybody else, and they don't want to do that. They are very distressed because of that. Paul wrote in Romans chapter 12 and verse 10, "Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor giving preference to one another." Yes, Epaphroditus honored and gave preference to the others, to his fellow Christians. And then we find that Epaphroditus also loved Christ and the church more than his own life. In chapter 2, in verse 27, Paul says, "For indeed he was sick almost unto death, but God had mercy on him, and not on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow." And then again in verse 30, he says, "Because for the work of Christ he came close to death, not regarding his life, to supply what was lacking in your service toward me." In his service for the church and his service toward Paul, he almost died. Now, we do not know what brought on his illness, but Paul said he regarded not his own life. This phrase is from a single Greek word which carried the idea of a gambler who stakes everything on a single roll of the dice. Obviously, here it doesn't refer to gambling at all, but it simply means that he boldly exposed his life to danger, staking it all on Jesus Christ. He performed his duty to Paul and to the church and to Christ, knowing that it might cost him his life. But it didn't matter, because he counted the cause of Christ more important than his own life. We need to have that same attitude, that the cause of Christ is even more important than ourselves. 1 John 3 and verse 16, John said, "By this we know love," talking about the love of Christ, "because he laid down his life for us, and we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren." Yes, Epaphroditus loved his brother, especially Paul, so much that he was willing to literally lay down his life, and he almost did. But it does illustrate one other thing. Just because we get sick, even unto death, does not mean God doesn't love us. Obviously, God loved Epaphroditus. Epaphroditus was a very faithful servant of of Christ. Paul was a faithful servant of Christ. And yet, even though they were all faithful servants, Epaphroditus got sick and almost died. Yes, Epaphroditus might have been a great servant. He was behind the scenes, so to speak, but yet he was worthy of great service because he was a hero of the faith, and heroes are worthy of great honor. We can't all be a Peter or a Paul, but we can all be an Epaphroditus. We can simply serve others. And notice how Paul describes him in chapter 2 and verse 29. Paul wrote to the church in Philippi and said, "Receive him, therefore, in the work with all gladness, and hold such men in esteem." Hold him up. Give him a hero's welcome, so to speak. Now, some people might say, "Well, why do you want to do that? He was just an ordinary Christian." But yet Christ said in Matthew 20 and verse 26, "Whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your servant." Epaphroditus was a servant. He was a great servant. And because he was a great servant, he could also be great in the kingdom of God. He could be worthy of great honor. And Paul wanted the Philippian church to hold him in great honor because he was a servant of Christ. May this encourage each and every one of us to simply be a servant of Christ. Not worry about who gets the credit, but do what we can to serve Christ and even to serve our fellow Christians, to hold everybody else up. We might not be nothing great like a Paul or a Peter, but we can be an Epaphroditus. We can be a great hero in the church of God. Thank you.